Hi, welcome to Grand Rounds. Today we have a special, added, extra Grand Rounds. So we're going to have our IPI introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rom. So, very pleased to be hosting Helena Hansen today for this talk, which is part of our occasional Cultural Psychiatry Track lecture series, sponsored by the APA Minority Leadership Fellowship from APA and SAMHSA. Helena is a practicing psychiatrist and anthropologist at NYU. She's got a joint appointment, Department of Anthropology and Psychiatry. And she does really interesting research really at the junction of those two fields. She has worked in Cuba on AIDS policy, urban Connecticut, on harm reduction needle exchange, and in Puerto Rico on faith healing and evangelical Christian addiction ministries. She's published widely in both medical, psychiatric, and social science literature in JAMA, Culture, Medicine, Psychiatry, and Medical Anthropology. And during her residency, she started the current project she's going to tell us about, which is looking at political, economic, and ethnographic study of biomedical treatment for addiction, opiate maintenance therapy, and buprenorphine. So please join me in welcoming Helena.
This is a very precarious setup here. I'm hoping to do a multimedia presentation, so we'll see how that works. I'm really honored to speak here today at a university that's really noted for its synergy of social science and medicine. You know, I've been inspired by the publications of a lot of your colleagues, and it's really exciting to be here. I was just joking with IPI too that I'm in a city that's noted for its exceptional policies and practices with regard to substances, ranging from coffee to narcotics. So, you know, I think it's somehow meant to be that I'm here. I'm really honored, though. So as Ippy mentioned, I'm jointly trained in cultural anthropology and psychiatry. I'm actually also an addiction psychiatrist, went through an addiction psychiatry fellowship, which was an extended participant observation opportunity for me. I'll get to that in a moment. I did my early field work in kind of traditional exotic locales like Puerto Rico and Cuba. But in the course of my residency and fellowship, I drifted toward an ethnography of the culture in which I have the most participant observation and fieldwork experience, and that is medicine. And there, I've been focused on a topic that's long interested me as an anthropologist, which is addiction. So addiction being itself something that has an unstable cultural status in our society, right? We continue to debate its status as a moral problem, a social problem, a biological problem. When I was a medical student, I began hearing about a new opioid medication that was being tested for maintenance treatment of opiate addiction, Buprenorphine, commercially known as Suboxone. Its advocates said that it would change the culture of medicine, that it was going to fully biologize addiction by placing its treatment in general medicine practices alongside asthma, diabetes, hypertension. And I was intrigued by this self-conscious attempt on the part of addiction treatment advocates at a cultural shift. You know, what was this culture of medicine that they had in mind? And who and what creates it, for what purpose? What difference does it make to people, patients, providers on the ground? So those were kind of my starting points for the study that I'm going to tell you about. And then I had a little bit of a journey. To understand this culture shift to pharmaceutical treatment of addiction, I spent 3 years participating and observing as a buprenorphine and methadone prescriber in public New York hospital clinics. Also observing meetings and addiction conferences among researchers and providers, administrators, interviewing over 100 patients, pharmacists, physicians, pharmaceutical executives, city, state, and federal policymakers. And I found some really unanticipated threads in the story involving government regulation, ethnic marketing, addiction stigma, race, and class. And I just want to say that it turns out economics were a big part of this story, and they were destined to be. The U.S. consumes 80% of the world's opioid supply, despite claiming only 4.6% of its population. I don't know how many of you knew that, but we are enormous consumers. And an opioid pain reliever, hydrocodone, otherwise known as Vicodin, is the most widely prescribed drug of any drug in the U.S., has been for many years, ahead of household names like cholesterol-lowering drugs, Lipitor and Zocor, for example. The opioids OxyContin and Percocet are not far behind. They're among the top 15 sellers. So we're kind of an opioid nation. And today I'm going to give a recent history of the politics and economics of opioid maintenance medications and end with a glimpse of my new effort to document it visually. So this is where my fingers are crossed for multimedia. Let's give it a shot. Okay. So, okay. Well, so these were slides that were meant to go with what I just said about us being an opioid-consuming nation, right? So on the top line is OxyContin, and that's the story that I'm going to tell you in a moment. And this is a story about Vicodin, the enormous growth in Vicodin sales. All right, so back to my story. It's 1965. Race riots have burned through Harlem, Philadelphia, and Watts, Los Angeles. The unemployment rate for blacks is twice that of whites, and the mafia gains control of Asian heroin imports, recruiting a sales force from black and Latino inner cities. Meanwhile, Rockefeller University diabetes researcher Vincent Dole, who conceptualizes heroin addiction as opiate receptor deficiency, analogous to insulin deficiency in diabetes, publishes findings from the first clinical trial of methadone maintenance with his co-investigators Marie Neisel and Van Creek. The study's subjects are African-American heroin-injecting men from Harlem, and its outcomes of decreased criminal activity and increased employment at 6 months brings national attention. By 1970, news of methadone as a pharmacological solution to the urban heroin problem reaches President Nixon, who appoints pioneering methadone psychiatrist Jerome Jaffe as the nation's first drug czar. And the names and the faces are reversed here, but you may recognize Nixon to your left and Jaffe to your right. Okay, so Jaffe targets inner-city blacks and Latinos as well as returning Vietnam veterans with methadone, the major weapon in Nixon's war on drugs. In order to prevent diversion and street sale of methadone, the DEA regulates methadone clinics, requiring daily observed dosing and regular urine testing. This may sound familiar to some of you. Due to community resistance in methadone clinics, the clinics are located in the most marginal neighborhoods of the city, remote from other medical services and occupying a place of ill repute in the American imagination. So let's fast forward to October 8th, 2002. A new opiate problem has developed. Prescription opiates are surpassing heroin as the major opiate of abuse in the U.S. and will soon be more widely abused than marijuana, following Purdue Pharmaceutical's aggressive marketing of OxyContin as a minimally addictive pain reliever, quote unquote. Most of these new addicts are white and many of them middle to upper income, like Rush Limbaugh. The FDA has just approved the synthetic opiate buprenorphine for maintenance treatment of opiate dependence. Oh, my joke slide, yeah. I'm glad you got that one. So the FDA has just approved the synthetic opiate buprenorphine for maintenance treatment of opiate dependence in private buprenorphine certified doctors' offices. Pharmaceutically similar to methadone in that buprenorphine blocks opiate receptors in the brains of addicted patients. So buprenorphine can be prescribed monthly for use at home. This is a different model than methadone, clearly. While methadone remains restricted to DEA-regulated clinics. And that's because buprenorphine has certain advantages over methadone, according to the manufacturer. It's a weaker opioid than methadone. It's less likely to cause overdose as a result. Also, it's manufactured with another drug, naloxone, which will cause withdrawal if it's injected, so with the opiate antagonist naloxone. Buprenorphine's manufacturer persuades the FDA that it's safer and less abusable than methadone, and therefore can be taken at home. So this is the first time since the 1914 Harrison Act that generalist doctors are permitted to use opiates to treat opiate addiction. Addiction specialists hail it as a sea change in the culture of medicine, and that's where I had entered the story, if you remember, even as a medical student. So treating addiction in the same settings as other chronic medical conditions and desegregating addiction treatment from the rest of clinical medicine. This breakthrough in federal law is the result, on one hand, of a campaign on the part of addiction treatment advocates at NIDA, at the American Society of Addiction Medicine, the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatrists, who see in buprenorphine a route to less stigmatizing forms of pharmaceutical intervention than methadone. On one hand, it's the result of buprenorphine's manufacturer, Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals, seeking a new middle-class market niche for buprenorphine after buprenorphine failed to sell as a non-addictive opioid pain reliever. So it was actually shown to be addictive early on in its introduction. The federal government provided $23 million for research on buprenorphine as a neuroreceptor smart drug for addiction, and extended buprenorphine's patent protection with the manufacturer of Reckitt Benckiser through 2009 on a drug developed in 1972. Enabling Reckitt Benckiser to make $5 billion in the in U.S. revenues alone on the product. So through internet advertising depicting white, middle-class OxyContin abusers and a web-based treatment referral service. So this is a website put out by the National Association of Association of Advocates for Buprenorphine Treatment. It's funded by Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals. Buprenorphine becomes the answer to prescription opiate abuse. The targeting of white middle-class consumers also helps buprenorphine's manufacturer to reduce the stigma associated with addiction treatment. In an arrangement that practically guarantees that buprenorphine access will be limited to people with the means to go to private practitioners, particularly in the early years of its introduction, Reckitt Benckiser works with the DEA to develop an 8-hour certification course, a training required for any doctor who wants to prescribe buprenorphine. It's the first and only prescription drug to have a requirement of this kind for a separate prescription number certification. And public sector doctors who don't have the same incentive to spend time training or to recruit additional patients on top of their heavy caseloads tend not to get bothered to get trained for buprenorphine. Those who train for buprenorphine certification are, particularly in the beginning, specialists and private practitioners who are able to charge more for their affluent clientele more. Large fees in New York City, for example, around $1,000 for an induction visit for buprenorphine. The middle-class market niche and physician training requirements for buprenorphine lead the DEA to go along with its designation as a Schedule III drug, as at lower risk of abuse than most other opioids, which tend to be Schedule II. And the U.S. Congress, after many debates on the floor about how to address the rising number of quote-unquote suburban youths who abuse opiates but are quote-unquote not appropriate for methadone clinics that were developed for quote-unquote hardcore heroin users, they passed new legislation called Data 2000 that legalizes home use of buprenorphine, an opioid drug that is potentially saleable on illegal street markets. So let's take a moment to appreciate the irony of all this. Buprenorphine is really the latest in a long line of opioid medications marketed by pharmaceutical companies as non-addictive pain relievers and treatments for opiate addiction. And I'll start that story with heroin. Heroin was marketed by Bayer Corporation in 1898 as a non-addictive pain medication and treatment for morphine addiction. Then by the 1940s, heroin addiction was first treated with methadone and opioids synthesized in World War II Germany as a pain medication. And by 1996, as I told you, OxyContin was heavily promoted among primary care doctors by Purdue Pharmaceuticals after the FDA approved it as a non-addictive, actually a minimally addictive, quote-unquote, minimally addictive treatment for pain. And that designation therefore opened the market to generalist practitioners, primary care practitioners in the suburbs and the rural areas treating things like chronic back pain. That was the new market opened up by Purdue Pharmaceuticals with OxyContin. Then in 2002, buprenorphine, having failed to sell as a non-addictive pain reliever, was marketed among primary care doctors by Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals as a treatment for OxyContin addiction. So this is the cycle of the holy grail of the non-addictive opioid pain reliever and treatment for addiction. But one thing that's unique to buprenorphine is that it comes on the heels of President Bush, the first decade of the brain. So, yeah, there we go. This was a decade during which NIDA devoted its research agenda to biotechnological treatments for addiction and basic science locating the cause of addiction in the brain and biology of individuals. At the end of the decade of the brain, in 2000, a widely cited article was published by leading addictions researchers in the Journal of the American Medical Association entitled Drug Dependence, a Chronic Medical Illness. It demonstrated, and let's see, this is the article. Okay. It demonstrated that chemical addictions were comparable to diabetes, asthma, and hypertension in terms of heritability, contribution of environment, and treatment adherence. Now, this flew in the face of the received wisdom, both inside and outside of medicine, that addiction was a problem of morale, if not morality, requiring psychotherapy or support groups to address the emotional and characterological roots of self-destructive behavior. Addiction treatment had long been excluded from quote-unquote real medicine, with less than 1% of U.S. medical school curriculum time devoted to addictions, despite addiction being one of the leading causes of death in the U.S. In fact, addicted people were barely considered patients at that point. As most physicians in opinion surveys say, they would prefer not to treat people with addiction. In reaction to these attitudes, buprenorphine researchers speak about convincing doctors that addiction is a legitimate biological disease. And addiction specialists across the country used this article to campaign for placing addictions treatment in the mainstream of biomedicine with the idea that fully biomedicalizing addiction, treating it in the same clinics and in the same way as other chronic diseases, that is, with long-term medication, would destigmatize addiction, end decades of punitive addiction treatment, and desegregate addiction treatment from mainstream medicine. For these specialists, buprenorphine marked the coming of a golden age of smart drugs that could crack even the stubborn problem of addiction. The problem that pulls clinicians into a moral morass of mixed patient motivation, abusive prescriptions, and relapse. But as smart as buprenorphine might be, a well-known buprenorphine researcher admitted to me the most important difference between buprenorphine and methadone is that buprenorphine is not called methadone. It doesn't call up the image of homeless black and brown people waiting outside of makeshift clinics on the other side of the tracks, and therefore doesn't have the same DEA restrictions. And in fact, buprenorphine users are different than methadone users. Let's see. So this is a national survey. This is from a national survey. Actually, the last national survey that was done quite a while ago, 2005 was when the data was collected. But this one identified users as 92% white, over half employed at baseline, over half with at least some college education, 75% of them prescription opiate addicted. Compared that to methadone patients, who nationally are 53% white, 29% employed at baseline, and 19% with some college education, most of whom inject heroin rather than use prescription opioids as buprenorphine patients do. So in New York City, the city with the largest number of opiate-addicted people in the U.S., there really was no published data on the demographic patterns of treatment. So I, with colleagues, created a comparative map of buprenorphine and methadone usage in New York City. I was able to get zip codes of buprenorphine users because pharmacists are mandated to report back to the DEA any prescription that they write with zip code. And I got zip codes of all patients taking methadone in the 5 boroughs from the state agency that regulates methadone clinics. So the notable thing about these maps is that they're almost the inverse of one another. So the areas that light up for buprenorphine and the areas that light up for methadone are pretty much the inverse. And the buprenorphine usage was concentrated in the wealthiest neighborhoods with the lowest percentage of Black and Latino users. So this means that despite an early and aggressive campaign on the part of New York City's Department of Health, which actually has been an exception to the rule across the country, the New York City Department of Health identified buprenorphine as an HIV prevention tool and really pushed it among public sector physicians. This pattern in New York City still fits the national pattern from the last available national survey. So just this week, I've been really curious about how this has played out over time, and I was able to get some updated data from the state and the DEA. And what I wanted to show you were these graphs hot off the press of, this is buprenorphine usage, and these are zip codes by social area. So the steepest curve on the top, an increase in buprenorphine use between 2004 and 2011. The blue line is the highest income category of zip code with the lowest percentage of Black and Latino residents. So even though usage has gone up among all groups, and the curves on the bottom are the lower income and higher percentage Black and Latino resident zip codes at the bottom. So all groups have gone up, but really dramatic increase in use in the highest income and least diverse zip codes. So that's buprenorphine. And then this, and that's New York City. This is methadone use in New York City. And as you can see, the curve has started to drop off somewhat, especially around 2008. The top line is the lowest income tend to be Latino zip codes. At the bottom is the blue line that represents the highest income zip codes with the lowest percentage of Black and Latino residents, and it just remains at a very low level. What these two curves demonstrate is that overall, buprenorphine marketing has opened up new markets. So it's not as though buprenorphine is replacing methadone usage. It's actually just expanded the market to a whole new group of users. And I just wanted to mention, for those of you who know New York City, that those areas that lit up for high buprenorphine usage, including in 2011, were neighborhoods of Staten Island, Upper East Side of Manhattan, and Greenwich Village. So, it kind of plays out the validity of that. It triangulates with the statistics on the backgrounds of the zip codes reporting highest buprenorphine usage. So ironically, while early buprenorphine doctors saw themselves as reducing the stigma of addiction and democratizing medical care by bringing addiction treatment into doctors' offices, private doctors' offices, a two-tiered system of treatment has developed in which buprenorphine is largely restricted to middle-class or affluent white consumers with access to certified physicians, and methadone for the rest. It's a system that potentially increases the stigma of treatment for those who are left in the methadone group. Little has been written about the management of social identity and stigma from the point of view of people on buprenorphine, and that's something that I got interested in as an anthropologist. Or even of people prescribing, what's happening on the ground to manage buprenorphine in new settings with people who may or may not have been in treatment before this. So I did systematic observation and interviews with patients and providers in Bellevue's primary care clinic and chemical dependency program. It turns out that due to some activist doctors on its staff, Bellevue was the first public city hospital to treat significant numbers of buprenorphine patients, and continues to have the majority of buprenorphine prescribers in the New York City system, the public hospital system, that is. Bellevue bucks the trend of promoting buprenorphine among middle-class opiate users. It represents an informative counterexample of what happens when office-based buprenorphine is made available to low-income and ethnically diverse patients. So I found that despite buprenorphine's promise of less stigmatizing and less disempowering treatment than methadone, buprenorphine patients are still preoccupied with discrimination. They're also preoccupied with the locus of control over their prescriptions and how they take their medications. They tell stories of institutional violence against people labeled as addicts by hospital staff. So for example, several people reported that when they come in with an acute medical issue, they rarely mention their addiction history to providers, because if they do, they know the staff won't treat their pain and often won't even examine the affected part. So that's one level. And then I just wanted to quote one man who described his hospitalization for severe phlebitis when he was actively injecting heroin. He said, "I learned about rounds. Rounds is when the head doctor comes in with 10 people first thing in the morning, yanks off my gown and points to a huge boil on my A, and then tells them I'm an addict." So these are the type of experiences that they had with the medical system. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to talk about a few of these other points. Patients also obsessed over how they schedule doctor's visits, who decides how many times a day they take buprenorphine and what dose. They struggle to reconcile feeling normal, quote-unquote normal on buprenorphine, with being physiologically dependent on a powerful opioid. And they aspire to be drug-free. Many attempt to taper themselves off of buprenorphine against the advice of their doctors. Many complained of feeling chained to buprenorphine and to the clinical institutions that provided it. Some sabotaged clinic routines and clinic routines in expert ways by showing up for visits just a few minutes shy of the end of their appointment, by lying about their dose of buprenorphine in order to stock up on a supply, often shared with friends. Others crushed buprenorphine tablets and snorted or ingested small amounts throughout the day, which incidentally was recently found in pharmacological studies to be the more effective way of using buprenorphine for pain control. Those taking buprenorphine also, many of them had their own political economic critique of the global narcotic trade, both legal and illegal, how it fed the coffers of pharmaceutical companies. In other words, the disciplining moral work of Bellevue's physicians was often undermined by patients attempting to use buprenorphine for their own ends. And then I spoke with prescribers. And these prescribers were part of a vanguard of public sector primary care physicians politically committed to harm reduction among their addicted patients. They had lobbied for buprenorphine to be offered in their clinics, and they were prepared to make changes in clinic policies in order to accommodate their addicted patients. So for instance, the director of one buprenorphine service made his cell phone available to all new buprenorphine patients who needed real-time advice on how to adjust their dose and avoid withdrawal symptoms. However, these doctors were also aware of the precarious status of buprenorphine and DEA surveillance. So they really talked about their responsibility to keep buprenorphine out of street markets and to keep it from being diverted. In the clinic, they worked hard to keep buprenorphine in the cultural frame of a prescription medication rather than a pleasure-giving opioid. They reminded patients to take it at the same time every day as prescribed, preventatively, quote unquote, like a vitamin, and not to manage dosing themselves, among the patients. Doctors spent time assessing whether patients felt pleasure from the doses, which would have been an indication to lower their dose, and assessing whether patients were sharing or diverting their buprenorphine for sale, which would have been illegal. And this went along with disciplining of drug users into clinical routines. Staff meetings were consumed with talk about behavioral contracts regarding the consequences for missed appointments, late arrival for appointments, and lost prescriptions. A clinic administrator joked that her patients never came for scheduled visits, but called her on their cell phone from a car downstairs, as if she were a drug dealer. And one astute addiction specialist identified the issue as trust. She said, "It's understandable that people who are routinely denied medical treatment because they use substances would hesitate to give control over to a doctor." And I interpreted this to mean that it's difficult to destigmatize addiction by biomedicalizing it if biomedical institutions have been such potent sources of discrimination against addicted people. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now because hearing these stories of discrimination and addiction stigma, I often ask myself how my research might heighten public awareness. And film, for a number of reasons, including I'd been involved in a video self-documentary group at Bellevue in the Chemical Dependency Unit, where patients tell their stories on film and make documentaries. So inspired by them and some others, I began work on a video project, a documentary project that I received some support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for. And as part of this documentary, I'm following 3 opiate-dependent people through the addiction treatment system in New York City. I'm going to show you a clip of some of my interviews and also of Camille, a woman who's gone on and off of buprenorphine with great difficulty because she has been trying to access the treatment system, the public treatment system in New York City, and it has not been easy. 2 other characters that you won't see in this clip that's relatively brief are Ruben, a recently homeless man who's on buprenorphine and trying to find a home and a job, Ed, who is on methadone and struggling to reconnect with his children and with whom he has not had contact for 6 years. And they, along with Camille, are showing how the difficult social issues in their recovery are not addressed by their medications alone. So the documentary is highlighting 2 aspects of opiate maintenance treatment. One is the stratification of addiction treatment through ethnic marketing of pharmaceuticals, as I've just described, combined with bureaucratic exclusions that prevent some motivated people from getting treatment. And this is the theme of the clip that I'll show you. The second theme, which isn't so much present in this clip, is that the cultural model of addiction as a disease of neuroreceptors and reward centers of the brain, taken to its logical extreme, within a commodified healthcare system, emphasizing pharmaceutical over social intervention, that this may stand in the way of recovery as treatment becomes more privatized and individualized, and core problems of social marginalization go unaddressed. So let's hope that this video works, but it's about 9 minutes. It's kind of an extended trailer. Okay, if you give me a moment, I have to use our backup plan. I should just pull it from the drive, right? Okay. I know. It's just working.
They would never allow an illness to be treated in such a superficial way by just giving medication without services if this were a disease that largely affected middle-class whites.
I'm opposed to pure methadone maintenance treatment. There should be methadone for abstinence. That was mine. But there ought to be, if you're going to do treatment, but you have to do something about the living conditions. You have to do something about the socioeconomic conditions. You have to do something about families and so forth. And if you didn't do that, the addiction rehabilitation was going to lead to failure.
All addictions are not criminal behaviors, nor are they weak personalities. They are diseases of the brain with behavioral manifestations, although almost every family has somebody afflicted by alcoholism, nicotine dependency, or some other addiction. Very, very few will admit it publicly.
It dawned on me that addiction had been a big issue in my own family, but it wasn't talked about that way. That by that point, 2 of my uncles were dead.
There are a million addicts. That's what this drug is indicated for, treatment-seeking population. Some patients are appropriate for buprenorphine, some patients are not.
If our perceptions of heroin addicts have to do with race and class, then how we treat them is going to have to do with race and class.
Hi, Miss Annie. All right. Oh, I was telling your brother I'm ready to beat you in some basketball. You ready? Hello, darling. All right, how's your mom? It feels like a big old family. Yeah. Terry! Hello, Melanie! Melanie! Hi, baby. Hi, Melanie! Good God, look at you! Yeah. And you're the only one I beat in basketball. Why am I here on earth? There's obviously a reason for everyone, and because all my family died, I began to wonder, why am I still here and they not? Because none of them did anything but go to church and live by what God wants you to live by, not the extracurricular stuff with substances and things that tear down your body. Part of me is like, I had the feeling like when I see some people, I used to get so mad that this person is messing up so, and they still alive. I'm not saying my mother and my brothers were all that, but they didn't do nothing against what God wanted. But sometimes thinking about them, it's overwhelming. Corey's mother died, his father died, they were friends of ours. Mother died, overdose. Father died, drugs, plus he was getting AIDS by. He was about 6, 7 years old. He came and stayed. We took him in because he really Had nowhere else to go. That's why I love my grandson so much. You can't get it? You cover your mouth? This one me over. A friend of mine who's in the methadone program, which a part of me refused to go to because so many of my friends who joined it, it seems like it gets into your bones and stuff, and they start walking weird.
What does withdrawal feel like?
You start feeling like you got a film over your body. You start feeling like you're antsy and stuff. You start sweating furiously. When it's real bad, you get stomach cramps, you get diarrhea. You start throwing up, and you're throwing up to the point where you're throwing up bile. The finance lady told me that I could no longer come until I paid on this bill. So I stopped coming. I worked out a deal with the finance lady where I would have payments. I even paid on it. I had so much free time again. This is not on nobody, this is my problem, that I relapsed. Let me try your shoestring. Yeah, you play monsters?
Yeah, you try to room.
Yeah, hold me so you don't fall. What are you doing up there, little boy? What, you messing up my hair, little boy? No? No? My hair's whiting? Okay, go ahead, have fun. Be careful.
Heroin was created with the Bayer Aspirin Company in Germany in the mid-19th century. Methadone was developed in early parts of World War II because the Germans saw that their supply of pain medication, morphine, was being cut off gradually.
Starting even at the turn of the century, the media invented the terms dope fiends, and they were used as headlines. Something deviant, nefarious was associated with people who use drugs. The casual reader doesn't really get the full complexity of the interaction between people and drugs, legal and illegal. I was faced with a moral dilemma. I saw a certain desperation. I wanted something.
The feeling among a number of the leaders was that, again, this was a tool to enslave the black man.
There's a scuttlebutt in the street that these were white people further enslaving black people who were on drugs and doing it for the rest of their entire lives, and it was a bad thing, and I was part of that whole cabal.
See, that's the public relations dilemma that has not been able to be solved, that the people not doing well are all over the place. They'll go on any TV show, any newspaper article, they hang out all over the place in the park. The people doing well are invisible. They won't tell anybody they're on methadone, including their spouses.
From conversations with a number of people, looking that you could get a methadone-like drug, which would do the things that methadone did in terms of treatment, but would be better, be less toxic, less physical dependence capacity, and perhaps more useful. It has been against the law for doctors to give narcotics to maintain people. Buprenorphine had been controlled at a very low level of abuse in the Controlled Substances Act. There were big arguments with the feds, and government and the DEA about buprenorphine.
One of the concerns that we all have had is that buprenorphine was somehow going to help create a two-tier treatment system. It was a treatment system that the poor people, underserved and unemployed, would get put into methadone treatment, and everybody else, the employed and people with money, would be able to go into buprenorphine. Has it happened to some extent? I think it has, yeah.
My name is Mike. Played football in high school, sang in the church choir, and classic American opera. I used to look at people who used and abused drugs as people who were making a choice. They chose to do that. How could it happen to me?
Today, I tried once again to get me into a site in the rehab center. This time it was in Mineola, New York, a place called Seabreeze. But they said even though they have the plaques to say that they do treat the mental health part of you also. They told me and Mary they don't have the doctor on call there because it's not a hospital. When we got there and they saw the medicines I took, supposedly, maybe I'm being thinking too much about it, but this is my feeling. I wasn't the right caliber person. I would have been happy if it didn't turn out that way. I like happy endings. I believe in fairy tales.
Let me try to get us back to the presentation. This gives you a flavor of what I'm working on with colleagues right now. We're in the editing phase of this project. Okay, so yeah, I would really appreciate your feedback on this new phase of my work in visual media. But just to kind of tie up the points that I was making from my study, I want to leave you with some points that might be counterintuitive at first. The first, that biomedicalization can reinforce social inequalities. So ironically, the biomedicalization of addiction treatment and its mainstreaming into general medicine that its advocates hope would ultimately eliminate stigma is made possible because of its association with a white middle-class clientele, just due to the political economic circumstances of addiction treatment in this country. So this association has led to a two-tiered system of treatment that further marginalizes low-income, non-white patients. And it reveals how much biomedical industries, marketing, and drug policy rest on race and class-based images of addiction, legitimate patients, and legitimate treatment. It also reveals the seemingly universal and impersonal technology of biomedicine to be part of a moral system that can value different straight of people and their suffering differently. And then this is the second point. So my observations in Bellevue's clinics indicate that even if office-based buprenorphine were widely accessible across race and class, the most marginalized patients may not experience buprenorphine as destigmatizing. As Bellevue patients reported, if medical institutions have historically stigmatized particular groups, then members of those groups will not necessarily feel less stigmatized if their condition is medicalized. And then another point. Addiction pharmaceuticals reveal race as an engine of biomedicalization itself. If the U.S. economy and corporate strategy have long rested on hierarchies of race and class, if, for example, snack foods and soaps and real estate are ethnically marketed, then we can expect that biomedicalization through privatization and commodification of medical technology would be no different. Methadone and buprenorphine are flip sides of the same coin. They demonstrate that biotechnology varies by market segment, with methadone on the racialized, surveillance-based, externally regulated end, and buprenorphine on the racially unmarked, consumer choice and internally regulated end. And then a final point, that as I speak, the terrain of buprenorphine regulation and marketing is shifting. So the DEA is responding to reports of black markets for buprenorphine with heightened surveillance. Surveillance of registered buprenorphine prescribers, myself included. My colleagues at Bellevue and I have all been visited by the DEA with requests to view our buprenorphine patient records. Some of you in the audience may have experienced that yourself. It seems to be a national campaign. Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals has gone ahead has tried to get ahead of this law enforcement curve in light of the expiration of its patent on Suboxone, the commercial name for buprenorphine and naloxone combination. They've introduced a newly patented formulation of buprenorphine delivered in dissolvable strips, which the company says are harder to cheek, smuggle, or inject. In the past 3 years, these strips have gained 75% of the buprenorphine market, with Reckitt continuing to enjoy a 60% profit margin on buprenorphine products. And as you may have read recently, just after the patent on buprenorphine tablets ran out, the manufacturer voluntarily withdrew them from the market, citing safety concerns given young children who'd opened bottles of tablets. The company then lobbied the DEA to keep generic tablet manufacturers out of the market based on these same safety concerns. Their effort was unsuccessful, but it illustrates the company's efforts not only to keep market share, but also to keep its markets high income and elite through high prices on patented formulations. So I visited the company headquarters, which are on the top floor of an unmarked suburban medical building in Virginia. It's really a stealth operation that has managed to keep its profits well hidden until this year because they're a private company and not required to report their earnings. When I interviewed the former CEO of Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals, he failed to laugh at my joking observation that Purdue Pharmaceuticals, manufacturer of OxyContin, was getting into the buprenorphine business by patenting a buprenorphine patch so that they could continue to profit as patients get addicted to OxyContin and their primary care provider prescribes, who can then transfer them onto buprenorphine patch as an addiction treatment. And in my mind, Purdue and Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals are competitors. But it turns out that the former Reckitt Benckiser CEO that I was interviewing sits on Purdue's advisory board. So it turns out that corporate medicine remains an intriguing hidden population with secret societies and exotic practices for anthropological study. Let's see. So I understand that there may be people writing in questions, but should I?
We have like 8 minutes for questions.
Yes.
I assume that our patients can't get buprenorphine because of funding in Seattle. I'm curious about it in New York.
Okay, so I don't know the situation in Seattle, but in New York, Medicaid covers buprenorphine, and it has for quite a while. Unlike some other states, buprenorphine is not covered in all states' Medicaid plans. The real bottleneck is prescribers. So the 8-hour certification requirement that I just mentioned, and the fact that public sector doctors are already overloaded and not really looking for a new clientele, those things have combined to really severely limit the supply of prescribers in New York City, most of whom are in the private sector and private practice. And in fact, many of them don't even accept insurance. They ask for out-of-pocket fees for buprenorphine treatment. So that gives you an idea of the clientele that they serve. Yes.
I needed some clarification. I guess it's maybe my worldview or something, but I've always thought that the only color corporations are usually interested in is green. and I sort of heard that in this that they were doing a lot of lobbying and a lot of things to get things their way, and they're targeting people with money. And and this is where I was not clear. When you described it as sort of ethnically based marketing, it sounded like it was economically based marketing.
Yeah, it's both. There's an economic logic to targeting segments of the population. So in the case, the argument I'm really making is that the legislation that was passed, all of the regulatory approvals that were gotten through in order to enable generalist doctors in their offices to prescribe buprenorphine. This is a huge shift from the model of really highly restricted methadone clinics. That was possible because of the association of the potential clientele with white, young, suburban, rural people, high income as well, people. So it really, the image of the potential clientele was a big selling point. Congress was facing this middle class white heroin and then prescription opiate abuse epidemic and looking for essentially a separate treatment system, a way to address this that wasn't going to involve the methadone clinic system. So that's where race came in, and to follow up on that, the manufacturer, I don't think I can easily pull it up, but one reason I showed the internet website and the ad in the clip of Mike's story is that if you can go to the website NAABT.org, National Association for Advocates of Buprenorphine Treatment, and you will see very few, if any, black or brown faces. You will see people in business suits largely. Mike is a diner owner, so he's maybe more on the blue-collar side, but it's very clear which clientele are going for, and the medium, that it's internet-based, with an internet-based prescriber referral service. So that's my argument, is that they got around the stigma of heroin and opioid addiction in order to get laws changed, regulatory structures changed, and that required a certain racial image tied to class, tied to high income, potentially clientele. So it's an economic logic that taps into a lot of our stereotypes about race and class and addiction. Let's see, I'll go to the back and then come
Is
back.
there clinical trials data to say that methadone and buprenorphine are equivalent, or are they different in different populations? Are they equivalent for treatment of heroin versus treatment of OxyContin addiction? And what is it research saying?
That's a great question. So there have been a number of comparisons, meta-analyses, for example, on the data that does exist. There haven't been a ton of head-to-head comparisons of methadone and buprenorphine, but there have been some. So there's a Cochrane review, for example, that showed actually not huge differences in outcome. I do want to point out, though, that in New York City, some of my colleagues based at Bellevue and NYU did a study of Rikers Island inmates upon release who were opioid dependent, and they were randomly assigned to methadone versus buprenorphine. This was a low-income and largely ethnic minority population. These were, inmates upon release, and it turned out that the buprenorphine group actually had longer retention than methadone, and they reported higher satisfaction with their treatment. So that's just that's a study that really called into question an idea that many addictions providers have, that buprenorphine is more suitable for, quote unquote, stable, employed, middle class clientele who can come to doctor's office visits regularly and things like that. So there's a lot of complexity there. And one thing that I'm exploring in the film that you saw a little preview clip of is how people with a lot of social needs fare in the treatment system that's becoming more and more pharmaceutical based that we have for addiction. So it's a complicated problem. But I think it's difficult to say, based on a study like that of the Rikers Island inmates, that you can simply dismiss that people who don't have stable housing, employment, etc., cannot do as well as people who do on office-based treatment. So it's a very complicated story, but that's kind of a short answer that just calls into question that assumption. And then,
has New York done anything with or the state of New York done anything with the chronic versus bridge way that the FDA originally let people use buprenorphine? Like state Medicaid here only gives you a year.
Oh, right. So limitations, you mean, on the time that people can be maintained on buprenorphine. Really, I think in the mainstream addiction treatment thinking in New York City is that buprenorphine, for many patients who have relapsed a lot in the past, is something that is a very long-term treatment for them. So they really have in mind this chronic relapsing brain disorder idea that there are people who may need to be almost for life maintained on some sort of opioid, and that buprenorphine steps in the place of methadone for that kind of long-term treatment. So there really is very little discussion of limiting the time that people are on buprenorphine, and not a lot of discussion about how to taper people off or what kinds of support they might need or other types of treatment they might need in order to transition to a non-pharmaceutical based treatment or recovery program. Yes?
If you could wave your wand and sort of change national policy about that, or DSHS policy about buprenorphine or Subutex or anything like that, what do you think would be necessary to correct some of these disparities?
That's a great question, and I'll try to answer it briefly. So one thing that I want to make clear is that I think that these medications do have a role. I'm not saying that they don't have a role, given the realities that are in front of us. But I certainly am also very aware of the enormous disinvestment that's going on right now in social interventions and psychosocial support for people in treatment for addiction. So the problem is that so many of our investments are being, if they were there to begin with, often they weren't, but they're being put into the pharmaceutical itself rather than everything that surrounds the person who's struggling with addiction and maybe a fuller view of recovery. What kind of life are they going to have for themselves after they stop using the substance that they've been using? So that's where I want to see a lot more attention to recovery campaigns and creating broad-based programs and interventions. And there are going to be different kinds of needs for people at in different parts of the social hierarchy. Well-off people are going to need a different set of interventions than people like Camille, who are struggling with housing on a day-to-day basis and supporting her grandson. But I think both groups still require some attention to things that are beyond the pharmaceutical itself. So that's where I want to see a lot more attention placed on a fuller view of recovery and what's necessary beyond a pharmaceutical, which is one tool, but one tool of many.
So why don't, out of time, so if people have continued questions. Okay, so we'll take an online question, see if you haven't taken any, and then we'll end the formal part. But if you have questions or want to continue the discussion, feel free to come up.
Oh, the patent. Someone's curious about the patent for Suboxone tablets. Well, the Suboxone tablet expiration has already happened. It was 2009. But I think perhaps the film is what some people are curious about. And it's got, let's see, I'm not going to do the calculation in my head, but it's got about a decade left. So it's, that's a large window of opportunity for the manufacturer. And one reason they're investing so much effort right now into convincing formulary directors and other people that film is preferable to tablets for many reasons. Thank you.